Did you know that in the US, over 600,000 people are still arrested every year for cannabis-related offenses? This all began nearly a century ago, with men like Harry Anslinger, a name you may not know, but one that shaped the future of cannabis prohibition. In the 1930s, Anslinger led a crusade to demonize marijuana, using fear, racism, and misinformation to build a nationwide campaign against the plant. He once said, "Reefer makes darkies think they are as good as white men," tying cannabis to his broader war against immigrant and minority communities. This wasn't about protecting public health, it was about control, fear, and racism. Anslinger worked hand in hand with powerful media moguls like William Randolph Hearst, whose newspapers spread sensational stories of violent crimes linked to marijuana use. These lies paved the way for decades of prohibition, leaving millions, disproportionately Black and Latino, imprisoned and marginalized. But this is more than history, it's an ongoing struggle for justice. The damage didn't stop with Harry Anslinger. By the 1970s, President Richard Nixon escalated the fight against cannabis with the war on drugs, a war not on substances, but on people. Nixon's administration used the war on drugs to target two groups, Black Americans and anti-war activists. In a moment of rare honesty, one of Nixon's top aides, John Ehrlichman, admitted years later that the administration couldn't outlaw being black or protesting the war, but they could associate both groups with cannabis and other drugs. And they did just that. The war on drugs led to mass incarceration, with Black Americans being arrested for cannabis possession at rates up to 4 times higher than white Americans, despite similar usage rates. People like Bernard Noble, who was sentenced to 13 years in prison for possessing just 2 joints. Families torn apart, futures stolen, all because of a system rooted in racism and fear. These are not isolated cases, they are the reality for hundreds of thousands across the US today. Weldon Angelos was a music producer with a promising career ahead of him when he was sentenced to 55 years in prison for selling a small amount of cannabis to an undercover officer. His excessive sentence, driven by mandatory minimums, became a symbol of the injustice of cannabis-related incarceration. Kemba Smith was a college student with a promising future ahead of her when she was sentenced to 24.5 years in prison for a nonviolent drug offense. She became entangled with a drug dealer and, although she wasn't directly involved in dealing drugs, the government used her association to give her an extreme sentence. Her story symbolizes the countless women of color who were disproportionately swept up in the war on drugs, forced to pay the ultimate price for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. After years of public pressure, Kemba's sentence was commuted in 2000 by President Clinton, but her life and the lives of her family had been forever altered. But the tide is changing. From the streets to the state houses, activists are fighting to reverse the damage of these unjust laws. People like Jack Heer, who spent decades advocating for legalization and the industrial benefits of cannabis, called out the lies of the prohibitionists. Or advocates like Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, who revealed how the war on drugs became a modern tool for racial control. Today, states are legalizing cannabis, expunging criminal records, and releasing those wrongfully imprisoned. But this is only the beginning. Despite progress, the fight for true justice continues. Legalization isn't enough. We must repair the damage done, through expungement of records, social equity programs that ensure communities most affected by the war on drugs have a stake in the industry, and a commitment to ending the racial disparities that still plague cannabis enforcement. The struggle for cannabis justice is an ongoing battle. But together, we can dismantle the myths, undo the harm, and build a future where cannabis isn't a tool of oppression, but one of liberation. This is Schedule 1. This is what we're fighting for. From prohibition to liberation, the fight for justice continues.